In one of my favorite moments from Truman Capote's Breakfast at Tiffany's, Holly Golightly, while touching up her makeup in the back seat of a New York City cab, says, "There are certain shades of limelight that can wreck a girl's complexion." I am thrilled to see Teresa Deevy in the limelight as the star of this conference, and I'm confident her complexion would sustain all the bright lights shining upon it now. Many thanks to Drs. Una Keeley and Kate McCarthy and Maynooth University for adding extra wattage to those lights. So many aspects of Teresa Deevy's life, plays, and personal challenges merit focus. But having devoted much of the past 40 years to writing, publishing, and lecturing about Irish women playwrights in general, and Teresa Deevy in particular, I'll limit myself here to how I ran across the name of this seemingly obscure 1930s Irish playwright, and how I proceeded to dig up information about her life and works. At the risk of sounding as old as I actually am, I've been fascinated with Irish theater for nearly 50 years. My 1976 master's degree from Catholic U in Washington, D.C. focused on Synge and his female characters. After subsequently failing to become an overnight Broadway success during my acting stint in New York City, I embarked upon a doctoral degree with the hope of focusing on an Irish woman who needed a spotlight. But if the woman is not already in the spotlight, how can one locate her in order to change her position from the shadows to the limelight? Flashback with me to the early 1980s, when I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, searching around for an unexplored dissertation topic that would place an unrecognized but deserving woman center stage on the Irish theater. In October 1983, I unexpectedly discovered Teresa Deevy's name in Mee Holloway's 1974 book, Theatre in Ireland. In a chapter entitled The End of the Beginning, which focused on the Abbey Theatre in the 1930s, two sentences caught my eye. Quote, "After the death of Lady Gregory in 1932, several women dramatists vied for a place in the sun. The most interesting was Teresa Deevy, who in The King of Spain's Daughter and Katie Roach wrote sensitively of willful and romantic young girls who try to come to grips with the workaday realities of a man's world." End quote. My heart skipped a beat. Who was this woman, and why had I never heard of her? I was thrilled to read that sentence, located at the bottom of a right-hand page. Although I'd been working on Irish theater for a number of years, here was a name I had never encountered. And she was a woman. Since she was deemed one of the most interesting, I ravenously turned the page to read more about her. But there in front of me was a change of topic, a paragraph dealing with Frank O'Connor's Abbey Theatre battles with Yeats. That was it. Not another word about Deevy, or, for that matter, any of the other women who vied for a place in the sun. Hence began my very uphill challenge, pushing the rock like Sisyphus, trying to find information on women in the shadows of theater history. In those early 1980s, pre-Google, pre-internet days, I looked in the indexes of every book I could find on Irish theater in general and the Abbey Theatre in particular, but found no mention of Deevy. With the encouragement of Richard Heinskill, an enthusiastic reference librarian at the University of Oregon, I also consulted the good old Reader's Guide to Periodic Literature and came upon a 1956 journal article by Irish poet and critic John Jordan entitled Teresa Deevy, An Introduction. I then found Irish poet James Liddy's entry on Jordan in Robert Hogan's Dictionary of Irish Literature, and then, via the almost bygone phenomenon of snail mail, proceeded to write to Liddy, whose Wisconsin whereabouts my sleuthing skills had unearthed. Liddy kindly wrote back and furnished me with John Jordan's address. In December 1983, I wrote to Jordan and was thrilled to receive his gracious reply 2 weeks later. I opened the letter with a hopeful heart, only to feel it sink with the second sentence. Dear Miss Kearney, thank you for your letter about Teresa Deevy and your kind words about my article. Alas, I can give you little help. I met Teresa Deevy only once in 1955 or 6. The only friend of hers I ever met was Lennox Robinson, who of course was to die in 1958. Me Hollow Hay of the Abbey Theatre may have memories, but at the moment your safest contact is a young Waterford man who has been researching Teresa Deevy on a non-academic basis. He is Sean Dunn. He has been in contact with the Deevy family in Waterford. I will let him know by this same post that I have given you his address. It will be up to him, of course, to decide how cooperative he can be. I'm sorry not to have been of more help. I would be very glad to hear of your progress. Yours sincerely, John Jordan. The truth is, Jordan helped me immensely by putting me in touch with the Waterford-born poet and journalist Sean Dunn, who resided in Cork. I promptly contacted him. At that time, Dunn was working on an article for the Cork Examiner called Rediscovering Teresa Deevy, which would come out in March 1984. With the most wonderful New Year's wishes, I received a response from Dunn in January 1984, in which he graciously offered to share his wealth of Teresa Deevy materials with me. He also opened his family's home to me and offered to arrange meetings for me with any members of the Deevy's family. I was ecstatic and started planning to come to Cork for that summer. Through the open-hearted generosity of Dunn, I was introduced to Jack Deevy, Teresa's nephew, who lived at Landscape, the lovely Waterford home in which Teresa Deevy grew up and lived most of her life. After I answered Jack's bewildered question, why would anyone be interested in my old Aunt Teresa? He graciously granted me access to all of Deevy's estate papers at Landscape. And the rest is Irish theatre history. Although these 5 men who aided me have gone west, I am forever grateful to them. Thus began the litany of saints and scholars to whom I wrote, whenever possible including a self-addressed stamped envelope in order to encourage replies. I corresponded with poets, professors, theater directors, and biographers, among others. With my faithful pocket tape recorder, I also pursued and was granted interviews with multiple members of Deevy's family, John Jordan, actors and directors from the Abbey, and her friends Phyllis Doolin and James Chasty, among others. With each inquiry, I asked for any avenues they might steer me down, and with each reply, I pursued those suggested avenues, along with the many side streets and sometimes dead ends to which they invariably led. I remind those younger scholars and performers that this research was incredibly more painstaking and slow than that of today's world. Writing these letters, mailing them to the other side of the pond with much more expensive postage stamps, setting up these interviews, walking through the inimitable Irish mist towards a phone box, pockets full of heavy coins and lists of phone numbers. A different world, a slower process for sure. Of all my correspondence sleuth work, one of my most memorable replies was from Me Hollow Hay, RTE radio producer and Abbey Theatre board member. I had referred to his correspondence with Deevy, which I read in her estate papers in Landscape. He sent me this letter in care of Sean Dunn, who, once again, had graciously invited me to stay in his family's home in Cork during my second summer of Deevy research. Anniscole, 10 August 1985. Dear Eileen Kearney, just as I received your letter, I was putting together a collection of Teresa Deevy's correspondence for the National Library. I have found letters and 4 pages of a manuscript connected to her play Supreme Dominion, which cover a period 1947 to 1963. It occurred to me that you may like to purchase these for your own use, and later for sale to the University of Oregon or some such institution. Because of your special interest, you can have all of these for £250, which is less than the going rate. If you are interested, let me know when you can call here. My personal recollection will be slight in contrast to the importance of this new source material to which you can have exclusive access. With best wishes, Mahalo Hay. I remind you that at this point I was still a financially challenged graduate student who had become accustomed to the culinary limitations of soup and noodles, which is why the Dunn family's hospitality was so greatly appreciated. After Sean and I had a good laugh about O'Hay's sales tactics and asking price, which was roughly equivalent to about $800 today, I declined to answer the man with the treasure. Some folks just aren't into sharing. 2 of my favorite interview stories were related by Teresa's niece Miriam Clark and her nephew Jack Deevy. After Deevy's stroke of good luck at the Abbey was waning, Miriam lived with her aunts, Tessa, as Teresa was called, and Nell, who was Tessa's interpreter, at their Waterloo Road flat in Dublin from 1942 to 48. She recalled her Aunt Tessa wearing unfashionable clothing, ghastly frocks, and mismatched socks. She frighteningly witnessed Tessa riding her bicycle to meet someone in Grafton Street, oblivious, of course, to any traffic noises, wearing an old woolen coat that still had the wooden hanger on its back. Her aunt was apparently a terrible cook. As Miriam told me, if Tessa's life depended on her cooking, she would have starved. She was rather slender and was often so absorbed in her writing that she'd only have toast and tea, an affliction I've never had. Her nephew Jack commented that although she never smoked, she would occasionally take a sherry. I also remember another story Jack shared with me about his aunt's early days in landscape when the family was aided by their live-in nurse servant, Mary Ryan. The maid's room was above the kitchen, and Deevy family legend has it that the room was only accessible by ladder up to the trapdoor in the ceiling of the kitchen. The ladder was promptly removed after the maid's retirement every night, making it impossible for her to escape to see her boyfriend. Perhaps this story inspired some of Deevy's future characterizations of frustrated, confined servant girls. By the time I met Jack and his wife Nolene, the trapdoor had long since been boarded up and refinished. By now, many of us are quite familiar with the main events which shaped Deevy's childhood, early education, university years, and adulthood. We recall her Catholic upbringing as the youngest of 13 children in the comfortable surroundings of landscape, her love of music and sports in her early education, and her hopes of an arts degree and teaching. We marvel at her not allowing her loss of hearing due to Meniere's disease to hinder her ability to graduate from university. We admire her steadfast determination to learn lip reading while living with their sister Josie in London in the last days of World War I, and we share the interest she took in the lively theater scene during those years. We appreciate her return to landscape, where she began her serious playwriting. We applaud the success of her 6 plays at the Abbey. We imagine many famous Dubliners, such as Lennox Robinson, Jack B. Yeats, and Rhea Mooney, visiting her flat. And we mourn her surprise and hurt from the Abbey's 1942 rejection of her next full-length play. We reflect on her eventual return to Waterford, where she wrote religious-themed radio plays. We recall that even though in 1956 she was elected to the Irish Academy of Letters, a distinguished national literary honor, only 7 years later she died alone in a Waterford nursing home, just 2 days short of her 69th birthday, in one of the coldest winters in Ireland's history. The Abbey had a complex history of fostering new playwrights and then dropping them once the relationship was no longer fresh. Having enjoyed the limelight for most of the 1930s, Deevy was stunned by their 1942 rejection of her play Wife to James Whalen, which John Jordan hailed as her finest. Incidentally, this excellent play was later produced on radio by both the BBC and Radio Iran. But that rejection caused her to pause. She turned away from the stage and started writing for radio. Although Deevy's works virtually disappeared from the Abbey repertoire after 1936, the Abbey's experimental Peacock Theatre did produce another of her plays, Light Falling, in 1948. On the grand scale, however, it was obvious that her heyday at the Abbey was over. Someone asked me once how the rejection of one play could cause the undoing of a playwright. After all, most writers must deal with rejection. But bearing in mind the Abbey's prestigious distinction as Ireland's prominent national theatre, this was much more than a rejection per se. It was a divorce. And in theatre lighting terms, it was not a fade to black, but rather a blackout. In examining the post-Abbey correspondence between Teresa Deevy and her friend Frances Hackett in the Deevy Estate Papers, we know Deevy understood that Yeats had never been the biggest fan of her work. In fact, years later, Frank O'Connor, who adored her work, recollected what he caustically termed the Yeats Repair and Maintenance Service. In discussing Deevy's work once with Yeats and Lennox Robinson, O'Connor recalled, "Once when Yeats was grumbling to me about the charming plays of Teresa Deevy and muttering that she wouldn't let us rewrite them for her, Robinson said rudely, 'Teresa Deevy rewritten by you would be like Chekhov rewritten by Scribe.'" Ironically, while Yeats was alive, most of Deevy's submitted plays were accepted. Only after his death in 1939 did rejection come to her. And with the deaths of Lady Gregory in 1932 and Yeats 7 years later, many critics agreed that with the arrival of Ernest Blythe as its new managing director in 1941, the Abbey theatrical scene had changed utterly from Yeats's initial design for it. The center did not hold, nor did the theater-going public want it to hold. As only Sean O'Casey could wittily express it, the terrible beauty was beginning to lose her good looks. I'd like to leave you with a couple of personal thoughts about Teresa Deevy. Her Catholicism was deeply rooted, and while she had continually challenged Catholic traditions in her plays of the 1930s, her own faith remained unquestioned. Most of her life she attended daily Mass, said the Rosary, made novenas, and in her later years especially made pilgrimages to Lourdes and Italy. Her later plays had strictly religious themes, and her estate papers were full of holy cards commemorating different saints. Deevy is universally remembered for her kindness, generosity, and unworldliness. Because she did not complain, She appeared to have made her peace with being deaf. It is through writing that she chose to be heard, albeit with a sense of intuitive detachment. As Sean Dunn speculated, her impairment no doubt opened up new dimensions to her as a writer. In spite of her intense interest in the details of other people's lives, she was involved most definitely from a writer's distance, and that distance opens up her work to interpretive ambiguity. In thinking of how far we've come in recognizing the work of more women, I'm acutely aware of the vast number to whom we yet owe that duty. In the late 1980s, a few years after I had written about Teresa Deevy, my friend Kathleen Quinn asked a clerk in a Dublin bookstore where she could find plays written by Irish women other than Lady Gregory. He smiled and dismissively replied, "Women don't write plays," blatantly embracing the stereotypes and strictures inflicted upon women. His response prompted our grand detective challenge, and in a couple of years we had unearthed 75 of these playwrights, Deevy, of course, being one of them, and we knew there were many more to come. This launched the project I started with Kathleen, which later evolved into the annotated anthology Irish Women Dramatists, 1908 to 2001, which I co-edited with Charlotte Hedrick. I celebrate the resurgence of scholarly as well as production interest in Teresa Deevy now. We need to ensure that she holds a permanent place in the limelight rather than hovering in the wings. I am privileged to have laid the groundwork in the 1980s for much of this appreciation, and I applaud the creation of these archives in her honor. I have donated to them my copyrighted dissertation as well as our anthology. And as for the venerable book salesman's questionable comment that women don't write plays, oh yes, they do. Thank you.